Hi everyone, so this is going to be a relatively short lecture on advantages of the casting process. So by now we already know how casting is performed, what are the different types of casting, different types of molds, and what else we also know about the defects and so on. So in this particular lecture I will tell you about the advantages of the casting process compared to other manufacturing processes, which probably by now you already understand. Afterwards, we will also discuss a few mathematical aspects of casting process, for which I'll provide you a separate video. Okay, so intricate shapes. What are intricate shapes? When you have these very fine shapes and complicated shapes that are very close to each other and so on. And maybe sometimes also there are many shapes of the same time, many. Your part has many, some corners, a lot of corners, and all of them are very thin. All of this is called intricate shapes. Okay, for that, if you perform machining or if you perform anything top down, then it will be very difficult. It will be a very tedious task, and also you will end up generating, for example, a lot of stresses in the material which can lead to cracking and so on. With casting we can do it very easily. Once we make the pattern, then all we need to do is prepare the mold and then fill in the molten metal. And as long as we are taking care of all the casting parameters, we are making sure that the solidification is done on time and pouring is done without having gas bubbles and so on. In that case, we can make these shapes very easily using the casting process. So that is one big advantage, and that is why for many complicated shapes, casting is preferred technique. What else? So, by the way, there are also some examples here. Even you can see that starting from household tools and fittings and so on, all the way to airplane parts, various engine parts for automobile, very complex ones. Sometimes these parts are very large, which contain some hollow shapes and also some very intricate shapes and so on. So these very complicated geometries can be manufactured using casting process. Okay, low maintenance and relatively low production cost. So maintenance is, if you have a large machine which operates and which has multiple parts, of course more maintenance will be required. When you have just a mold and you're filling in the metal, then relatively less maintenance is required. So in that sense, low production, this also reduces the production cost. So that is one more advantage of the casting process. And again, depending upon what kind of casting you're performing, die casting or sand casting, maintenance will be slightly different for each case. But if we compare it with other manufacturing techniques, then it is a relatively low cost technique. Also, it enables large scale production. As I told you, during investment casting, you can make multiple parts in the same tree-like structure. So that even that is an example of batch fabrications. Now you're not making one thing, but let's say 50 of the same things in the same batch. So that is a batch production. So casting does allow for batch production as well. And also, once you have the pattern, once you have the mold, if it is a permanent mold or permanent pattern, in that case, you can repeat the same process again and again, and you can get the same dimensions. If you will perform machining, then always you will get slightly different dimensions, right? But here you will get, as long as your pattern, your mold is the same, you can get this, you can have a good reproducibility in the process. Okay, what else? Hard metals. There are certain materials, and we'll talk about other materials as well, but in the case of metals, certain metals are hard to machine. And whenever there are things that are hard to machine, machining means you have to remove the material in a top-down process. Then in that case, it becomes much easier to perform casting, because if, as long as they have, especially metals and alloys, as long as they have a defined melting point, and melting freezing is all we care about. We don't really care about the nature of the metal as such, whether it is a hard to machine metal, what kind of mechanical stresses will be generated and all. We don't care about all this. We only care about their melting point when we talk about casting process, right? So those metals which are less malleable and less ductile, right? So making sheets or wires out of them is otherwise difficult. With casting process, we can work with them relatively easily. Okay, this is a single step manufacturing, so you don't require joining, and that is also something very interesting. I like it. We don't need to do anything. Once you're done with it. You can just perform surface polishing, finishing a little bit, but you don't need to really go for secondary operations. For example, if you make different little parts, different sub parts of your one big part, then you will have to think of welding or somehow joining it with the nut and bolt assembly and so on in the casting process. Once we have everything, whatever complex geometry you have, you make the pattern of that geometry, and then one go you perform everything. That is one more big advantage of the casting process. So it also, if you think of it, not just because of convenience, but also it saves a lot of time, right? It also saves a lot of manpower, and at the end, all that goes into saving cost. Okay, what else? Maybe you can think of some more. I have mentioned a few. Less restriction on part size. So casting, again, you can make from very small to very large parts. Although when the parts are very, very large, you have to be very careful with the solidification, patterns, because sometimes then you will have different walls, multiple walls. But anyway, as long as you can take care of that, you can make different shapes as well as different sizes using the casting process. Flexibility in mold design. Of course, there is a lot of flexibility in mold design. You can accommodate various shapes. So this is also again going back to the complex geometries. One more thing there is, that is various surface textures can also be accommodated. So not just the complicated or hollow shapes and so on, or intricate shapes, but also different surface textures also you can. So that is the flexibility. A lot of design flexibility is there in the in your casting process. And one very big advantage is that this is a well-known technology for several years. It's a very traditional manufacturing process, and that is why people have the know-how. Know-how means people know how to do it. Okay, so what kind of challenges will be there? What kind of safety precautions you need to take? You already have a lot of experience with the casting process. The society has a lot of experience, and that is the reason it is also a very commonly available knowledge and technique. Okay, so this was all about the advantages of casting. Now I want to tell you a few more definitions. Maybe I have missed them out. What is foundry? So whenever people talk about casting, they say foundry, foundry. Foundry is basically the name for the industry where casting is performed. So the entire casting industry, metal casting mainly, is known as foundry. So that is the terminology that is used. And also one more important definition, we'll have one more maybe lecture at some point where we talk about different types of iron or steels. But cast iron is something that is very important in reference to casting. It's called cast iron, right? This is basically not just one material, but the class of materials, ferrous materials, which are iron carbon alloys, and they have more than 2% carbon in them. So all the steels with more than 2% carbon, typically they are known as cast iron. They have a relatively low melting point, and that is why we can easily perform casting using them. Now this is also, maybe it can be a little more complicated. This is a general definition. They are very specialized steels and so on that we are not going into. All right, so these were the advantages of the casting process.